Welcome to the Books and Travel Podcast. I'm Jo Frances Penn, thriller and dark fantasy author, bringing you escape and inspiration about unusual and fascinating places, as well as the deeper side of books and travel. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, and if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my ebooks for free at jfpenn.com/free. Hello travellers, I'm Jo Frances Penn, and today I'm talking about the city of life and death. Yes, New Orleans, with Laura and Dan Martone. So New Orleans is one of those cities that has a special place in the imagination of a lot of travellers, even if you haven't been there. It's famous for loving life, for Mardi Gras parades, a vibrant music scene, drinking and eating, and gorgeous architecture in the French Quarter. But it's also known as the City of the Dead, with cemeteries, voodoo, ghost stories, vampires, and of course, the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. So in today's episode, native New Orleanian Laura Martone and adopted son of the city, her husband Dan, talk about the history of the French Quarter and some of the haunted buildings there, the best cemeteries to visit, vampires, voodoo and Creole cuisine, as well as what they love about the place. So I visited New Orleans in March 2017. I got the Amtrak train down from Chicago with some other writers, which I talked about with Jay Thorne in episode 18. And I spent a week in the city writing and also researching. So I am a taphophile, a lover of graveyards. I find them incredibly peaceful. I take a lot of pictures. And the City of the Dead is known for its wonderful cemeteries. So on my first available day, I went on a tour out of the historic Voodoo Museum, which is excellent. The wonderful guide, Norland's Nate, took us on a walk around the French Quarter. He explained the voodoo history and also talked about the slave trade. Then we had a tour of St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery that inspired the opening scenes of Valley of Dry Bones, which is partially set in the city. And that Valley of Dry Bones is one of my arcane thrillers, and it does feature a number of scenes in New Orleans. So I later visited the St. Louis Cathedral and found a copy of the Toledo Bible, which led me to visit Toledo in Spain a year later. And I'll have to write about that another time. But the links between the Spanish Inquisition and New Orleans, as well as San Francisco, might surprise you. Now, I love finding these threads of history that weave cultures together. And New Orleans is one of those places where it lies just below the surface. So trust me on this, skip Bourbon Street and head straight for the Voodoo Museum and the cemeteries, and you won't be disappointed. One of the other wonderful things I did was go kayaking in the Louisiana Bayou. I went with a company called New Orleans Kayak Swamp Tours, and I highly recommend this. You don't need to be a good kayaker. It's very slow going, but brilliant to see that side of Louisiana, obviously with the alligators around, but they're just hanging around. And the cypress knees, which I had never seen before, which, you can Google cypress knees or look at some of the pictures on the blog post, and also the Spanish moss hanging from the trees, the bird life, and also learn about the ecosystem of the bayou. So I put a lot of that experience into Valley of Dry Bones. There is a scene set out in the bayou and in fact, kayaking. So I do put a lot of my own travel experiences into my thrillers. And if I went back, and I think I definitely want to go back, it's one of those places I felt very at home, I would kayak again. It really was one of the most special things I did. So yeah, I love New Orleans. And in fact, one of the first things we do is talk about the pronunciation. So if you're concerned about mine, listen on. Right, so let's get into the interview. Laura and Daniel Martone write fiction in multiple genres, including space opera, post-apocalyptic, and urban fantasy. They lived in the French Quarter of New Orleans for many years and produced several audio walking guides. Laura has also written a guidebook to the city, and they now live in their RV, Serenity, and travel between New Orleans and Michigan. Welcome, Laura and Dan.
Hey, Joe.
Hi, it's so good to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show. So before we get into the questions, I have to ask about the pronunciation of New Orleans, because I think I got it from the song, the animal song, The House of the Rising Sun. But when I was there with you guys, people pronounce it differently. So let's start with pronunciation.
Okay. The funny thing is Dan always makes fun of me that I don't have a New Orleans accent, and I don't, but my whole family does. But I definitely, obviously, have been there long enough to know New Orleans is how I think most people pronounce it. That's how I say it. But people do say New Orleans. The thing that I think a lot of natives hate is Nolans, because Nolans is like this sort of, I don't know, hybrid or something. And it's definitely more of a manufactured thing. Some people will say it jokingly, but I think New Orleans is pretty standard.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so start by telling us a bit more about your links to the city and how you both came to live and work there.
Okay, I was born and raised there, so it's my hometown and it's my favorite American city. It always has been. We've both traveled a lot throughout the U.S. and other countries, so we've had a lot to compare it to, and there's no place like New Orleans. So I left for college when I was 17 and ended up at Northwestern University in the Chicago area. And after graduation, met Dan. And Dan's a little older than me, but we met at a job, just a wee bit. And we met at a job, and we stayed in Chicago for a little bit and then hit the road the first time in another RV and ended up settling in Los Angeles because we both were interested in being in the film industry as screenwriters and filmmakers. And so we were there for several years, and then Hurricane Katrina hit, and it destroyed all of my homes but one, all of my childhood homes. And I just felt this pull that it was time to go back. So we went there, and we started a film festival to kind of bring some awareness to what was happening in the city and, try to be a part of the rebirth of the city. And Dan just fell in love with New Orleans. Like, it suddenly became his favorite place and definitely his home. And I mean, he's an incredible cook. So as you would imagine, New Orleans is an amazing place for a cook to be. And he, has completely embraced the cuisine of the region and everything. So that's how we ended up being there. And then we ended up having an apartment and staying in the city on and off for a good decade before we hit the road again in, our second RV. So
the funny thing is most New Orleanians don't think of anybody that's been there for only like 10 years as a true New Orleanian. But for the most part, I get to blend right in with the natives. Well, they don't really realize that I haven't been there.
He married a New Orleanian, so it kind of counts. But also, he loves the city, and he often jokes that he knows it better than I do at this point, which to a certain degree might be true. So that's how we came to be there, and now it's pulling us back. Like, it's even home. Though, it's definitely home. So even with Serenity, we always kind of find ourselves back there. And
that's really interesting. And so you lived in the French Quarter, and we'll come back to that in the history side. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I'll just edit that bit. Actually, you didn't even mention the French Quarter. So, Dan, maybe you can talk about like where you lived and what it means to you as not a native.
Well, yeah, we lived in various apartments in the French Quarter, and that is the quarter is the center of the city. I mean, that's Vous Carré. Mm-hmm. It means
right, old square,
right?
In French.
And the city was built around that. So a lot of that history starts in the French Quarter. And it's one of those places, especially in America, because unlike Europe, most of America is so new. They're cities that are only 50 years old, 100 years old. Well, New Orleans is one of the oldest cities, and you could just feel the history walking through the quarter. Even after, various disasters have hit, it's still inspiring. So, I mean, we lived in various apartments where, we would hear the carriages go by with the tourists. You hear the clip clop of the horses going by. And pretty much everything about it was inspiring for us. And Laura's right. I just fell in love with the city.
And I loved the quarter as a kid. My mom had lived in the quarter when she was a young woman. And so I never got to live there. So it was kind of fun coming back as an adult and being able to actually live there with Dan, who appreciates it so much. So that was incredible for me too, even though, I was a native.
Yeah.
And I love every building in the French Quarter is haunted.
Yes.
there is a ghost story for almost every building.
Yes, that's true.
And I think, maybe that is because of the European history. And I think when I came to the city, I felt very at home there as well. And that probably is that European influence. I felt probably the same way in San Francisco and New York. I absolutely feel at home in as well. And it's interesting because, of course, the French Quarter, I then started to research more about the history of the city for my novel Valley of Dry Bones. And it's actually Spanish, right? So can you explain more about the history between the French and the Spanish?
Right. Well, it's an occupation thing. So, the French did establish New Orleans there. But then when Spain took it over bought it and took it over for a time, there were horrible fires in the late 1700s in New Orleans that really decimated a lot of the French Quarter. There are some buildings like Old Ursuline Convent and Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop Bar that predate the fires and that, managed to survive. But for the most part, it was pretty devastated. So because the Spanish were in control at the time, they rebuilt it. And they rebuilt it with their influence, which is, the wrought iron grill work and all of the way, just the way that a lot of the buildings look. And so that is what happened. It was the French Quarter. And I think people, obviously still call it that because that's what it was. I mean, that's historically what we called it. And we do have such French influence, in like Cajun and Creole cuisine. I mean, the French definitely have influenced our culture there. So it makes sense that it's still called that. But yes, it's a little odd that the architecture is more Spanish.
Yeah, and some of the history, like you go into the place next to the church there, and there's this picture of the Spanish friar and who was at the head of the Inquisition, and I just had no idea about that side of the place before I got there. But you mentioned some hauntings, so tell us about sort of one of the I guess most famous hauntings, or one of the more interesting ones that you like.
Well, I mean, obviously we did. A ghost tour, audio tour for it. I mean, there are a lot of places that are haunted there. One of the places that Laura and I lived, we lived in this building, and we discovered that there was a story about an old woman who would show up in the upper window with a light. And we did some research, and we found out that the forming of Texas, early in the U.S., when Texas was trying to form its own country, the organization was done in our building. So like the founders of Texas met in our building, and the light was supposed to be a signal to them that they, can come and it was safe to enter the building, that they weren't being watched. That's a story that's really not that well known. I mean, there are so many well-known stories.
Right. And I mean, obviously the LaLaurie Mansion would be probably one of the most famous ones in that area. I mean, there are conflicting stories about what happened, but basically the idea is that it was pretty much a horror show. The woman there, Madame LaLaurie, who, lived there, had slaves and apparently abused the slaves. And so there was a fire that broke out, and some of the slaves were killed. And then afterwards, it was discovered that basically they had been, mutilated and just horrible things happened to them. Now, whether that's all true or not, there are questions, but it's still considered one of the more haunted, places. And there is something creepy about it for sure. But as far as hauntings go, I think Dan and I are both kind of hopeful skeptics. Nothing has ever really happened to us but it's like we want it to, and we kind of believe in the feeling. I mean, it's like the history and the creepiness are definitely palpable. especially like late at night, if you're walking, around in the quarter in the wee hours and it's foggy, it's really almost easy to think that you're 300, you're back in the 300 years ago. I mean, there's just something about it that feels perpetually old, and historic and just filled with spirit. So it's neat. I love it there.
I mean, one of the other aspects is a lot of the buildings have had multiple uses throughout the centuries.
Right.
And when you find out that some of them were a hospital during the Civil War, and knowing how many people died in those buildings. And so, I mean, a lot of the ghost stories are based around that. Or like the Jackson Hotel, where it used to be an orphanage. And, back then a lot of kids died as well. So that people talk about hearing children, giggling through the hallways and creepy stuff like that.
Right. And I think, part of it is New Orleans. It's because of its history. There were pirates and it's a port city. So there were hurricanes and yellow fever epidemics and fires. So all of those disasters, obviously, killed a lot of people. And so that's part of why it's considered so haunted. But the thing that I also love about New Orleans is it's a very resilient city. I mean, I think one of its nicknames is the city that care forgot. And basically it's a city that always seems to rise from the ashes again, even Katrina. So I love that too. And I think that we are very resilient people, Dan and I, and have been through our own, adversity and gotten through it. So I think that we just really connect to the spirit of the city.
And again, in Europe, we just take it for granted that loads of people died everywhere that we live. I mean, that's, I'm where I live right now in Bath in the southwest of England. This was a Roman spa town, so right. there's been people here for thousands of years. So it's so funny whenever I come to America, and like I was in Orlando, which to me, I think Orlando must be the opposite of New Orleans. Yes. I mean, as in it really is so new and, with none of that history. But let's stay with death, because you have this great book, Zombie Chaos, and I love zombie books. And it's based in the city. And in fact, some people have even commented that it's got quite a tour aspect to it, which is very cool. And when you took me on a tour of the city, we visited some of the famous graveyards. So talk about those ones. What are the best ones to visit? Any unusual things to watch out for?
Well, I think that the first one, probably the most obvious one, and this is the one that tourists do go to, but I think there's a reason for it. One of the oldest ones is St. Louis Cemetery #1, and that is just outside the quarter. It's in an area called the Treme. And so it used to be that you could go take a tour on your own, which is, we were developing actually a cemetery tour for it when there was a bit of vandalism, I guess. Someone was trying to, I'll just explain this really quick. In there is a tomb that is considered Marie Laveau's tomb. Now, there again is a question as to whether her bones actually are in the tomb or if it's just sort of representative of her. She was the Voodoo queen of New Orleans, very big part of the city. And so a lot of people go to the tomb and they will leave like little favors for her, and they will mark 3 X's on the tomb and stuff like that, and then ask for something in return. And the idea is that if you knock 3 times, you write 3 X's, you leave little trinkets, she will, grant your wish. And so there was a lot of markings on it. And I think someone in the middle of the night decided to refurbish it by repainting it. I guess thought they were doing a good thing, but because of that, the city kind of panicked. And now you have to go on a tour through the archdiocese, the Catholic Archdiocese, in order to see it. So it's changed it a little bit, and we abandoned our tour because of it, because the whole idea of our tours is that they're self-guided. You listen to them and you can go on your own pace. But it's a fascinating place. The tomb is great to see. And then because our sister city is Cairo, Egypt, Nicolas Cage, in his infinite wisdom, decided to build a tomb that's in the shape of a pyramid. And it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb in a very old cemetery, but it is worth seeing because it's kind of amusing.
And of course, as we talk, he is not dead. That's just for the future.
Oh, yes. Let's be clear. I'm sorry. Yes, he is not. This is he loves New Orleans. There are a lot of famous people that love New Orleans, Brad Pitt, Nicolas Cage, and they have done a lot for the city. Like Brad Pitt did a lot after Hurricane Katrina with rebuilding some houses and stuff. So it's very important to a lot of people who aren't even from the city. And so, yes, Nicolas Cage, who once owned the LaLaurie mansion, the haunted one that I spoke of a little while ago, he decided he wanted to live there forever. So that's why he bought the tomb. But yes, he is still alive and well at the moment. And so I would say that one is a good one to start. But our favorite is actually the Lafayette Cemetery, which is in the Garden District of Uptown. So you can take the streetcar to get there. But what's great about it is it's very influential. It actually inspired Anne Rice, who obviously is a big author, big person from the city, who's written Interview with a Vampire and other books that have been definitely heavily influenced by New Orleans. And so it's a great place to go for inspiration. And you can walk around on your own. So it's not the same as other cemeteries. And there's a really great little area in it called the Secret Garden. That's these 4 tombs that were these 4 philanthropists that were friends and in life did a lot of like anonymous philanthropy and decided they wanted to live forever together. And so they built these 4 little tombs in this sort of secret garden that's off in a corner. And it's just lovely. It's a lovely, peaceful place. I think a lot of people think of cemeteries as creepy, but there's just something very peaceful about it. And it happens to be right across the street from Commander's Palace, which is one of the most famous restaurants in the city, which is kind of funny. But anyway, yeah, so I would recommend those 2 for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I love Lafayette, and I think we took you there, Joe, when you were in town.
Yes, we did. And Lindsay, yeah.
Yeah. And I think the great thing about it is, like Laura said, it's so peaceful. You can go find a bench and get a little work done if you want. I mean, it's very inspiring.
Yeah.
And the reason why Anne Rice, it actually is in the movie Interview with the Vampire, because she lived in the neighborhood at the time. That's why she was so heavily influenced by the cemetery. And I think you can do a little research online and find where she actually used to live.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Didn't she launch one of her books by getting in a hearse, pretending to be, sort of dead, and then riding through the city to the graveyard?
That is, yes. I mean, I've heard that. I never saw it, unfortunately, but yes.
That was actually, I think, the beginning of her. She has, at one point, was conducting every Halloween a vampire party.
Right.
The Lestat, it was a vampire party. And they're still going on now, but she actually doesn't run them. And I think that was the first one. And I think she did a little tour with the hearse, the rolling hearse. I think it was actually carriage drawn.
Yeah, which is so cool. But since we just touched on vampires there, coming back to the French Quarter, isn't there some legend about the convent? There's a reason why vampires are associated with New Orleans.
The casket girls, yes. I think I'm not really sure how the vampire aspect of it got created, because the casket girls are these young girls that came to New Orleans. I think it was in the 1760s, 1770s.
I can't remember exactly when.
Well, they brought cases. They brought cases with them that resembled coffins, where they had all of their possessions. So the whole tale is that there were vampires in each one of those.
Yes, that they smuggled them.
Some stories say, well, the casket girls were the caretakers of the vampires. Some say they had brought them to actually rid New Orleans of all the crime. So basically, let the vampires loose and go kill all the criminals and bad people, and then come back to their coffins. I think they had their clothes and shoes in those cases. Personally.
But, I mean, again, it's all part of the charm of the city. I mean, and a lot of places play up the haunted aspect and the vampire aspects and stuff like that. But
which is very cool. And of course, we have to mention zombies, because you have your zombie chaos book. And of course, I've written about voodoo, and I did a fantastic voodoo tour, and learned more about Marie Laveau and that type of thing. So, what is the association with voodoo? Why is it such a big part of the city as well?
I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with Marie Laveau. She was such a central figure I think she was born in the early 1800s. She came to prominence in 1830s as someone that people could go to for advice, or if you were a woman in the city, you could go to, and she would help, solve their love problems, do favors for people. She was just really entwined with everything that was going on in the city. But I think voodoo itself goes back to also Congo Square.
Well, and the Caribbean influence. That's
Right.
another thing we didn't mention, that even though the thing I think that makes New Orleans so special, or one of many things that makes it special, is the combination of the European and the Caribbean influence. And you even see that in the architecture too. A lot of the little Caribbean style bungalows and stuff like that. For instance, in the Faubourg Marigny, which is next to the quarter. And so I think that voodoo actually came from Haiti too, you know, and when Haitians came here as slaves or whatever else, I think that heavily influences it, because Catholicism is very important, in Haiti as well. And so is it in New Orleans. So that combination of Catholicism and voodoo is a very, rich part of our heritage. And so, yeah, I think Marie Laveau was a big part of it, but also because she, like I said, she was considered the voodoo queen of New Orleans. But I think that the Caribbean influence and the voodoo from the islands is definitely a big part of why, that is important to the city.
Yeah. And another thing that struck me, I think, again, because I come from a very multiracial society, and in different places in the US, like different places in England, are some are more multiracial and others are not. Mm-hmm. And of course, New Orleans is very multiracial, multicultural, however you want to talk about it. But it does seem very integrated compared to other places that I've traveled. So how does that affect the city and how the energy is, I guess?
Well, I think, that's part of the Cajun and the Creole influence. Cajun is more, I guess you'd say white folks from Canada,
French
Canadians. And then the Creole influence is more of a mixture of European and Caribbean. And I think it's a big part of it. I mean, the African-American neighborhoods are a very big part of the history. Congo Square, that's what Dan just mentioned, that's now in Louis Armstrong Park in the Treme, was the site of a lot of celebrations. It's where supposedly jazz got its start, so that's the other thing. Music is a huge part of New Orleans, and jazz and blues. A lot of our seminal, musical styles in the country came from New Orleans. And that's something that we love, because we love music and live music especially. So you definitely feel that cultural influence. And jazz and blues obviously is a big part of that, a big part of the African-American culture. The food, there's a lot of, soul food restaurants and stuff like that, and things that, you really get a sense of the multicultural aspects. And then Mardi Gras Indians at Mardi Gras time are traditionally African Americans from the African American neighborhoods, and they are so much fun. That's a big part of Mardi Gras. And so yeah, I think it's you see it every day. You see it everywhere. You eat it. You hear it. You definitely feel the mix of cultures. Yeah, and I think that's what makes New Orleans very special.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And I mean, you mentioned the music there and the Mardi Gras. So we've got to talk about that, because, of course, the graveyards and the city of death and everything is one side. But other people associate the city with booze and beads and, boobs and, really has this kind of over the top party atmosphere. But again, you mentioned the Indians there, and I just had no clue that they were, as you say, African American. And it's taken very seriously. It's a lot more than just kind of tourist stuff. So talk about Mardi Gras and Carnival.
Well, I mean, as far as the Mardi Gras Indians go, I don't even know how many tribes there are.
Yeah, currently. There are a lot of tribes.
But these guys are a big part of the celebration of Mardi Gras. They work on these costumes, these really intricate feathered costumes the entire year. And they have a chief, and they're very, very serious with
flag boy. They all have, different positions and stuff. And it's
during Mardi Gras, if you're in the right place, you could see two tribes face off. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are rumors that it all started, the Mardi Gras Indian tradition all started in order to avoid violence way back when. Mm-hmm. But now when you see them face off, they start to dance and they sing at each other. Mm-hmm. And it is an amazing sight to see these guys in 80-pound feathered costumes dancing, saying, I'm the big chief. And then the other one would be like, I'm the big chief.
Yeah, it's a lot of music and dance and color and revelry and the song Iko Iko. If you listen to the song Iko Iko, that would explain some of it. You know, you would hear some of the catchphrases and the words that are associated with Mardi Gras Indians. And they're kind of like the Indian factor is that it's sort of like they feel like they're sort of a unique version of American Indians. You know, it's like they're the native culture of New Orleans and everything. So that's kind of how that relates to Indians. But of course, it's a New Orleans style, even though, yes, they have feathers and big headdresses like American Indians. It's all very New Orleans, you know, the colors, a lot of Mardi Gras colors. You'll see purple, gold, and green, but lots of other stuff too. And, they're fascinating, but you have to kind of be in the right place because they take it very seriously. So it's not quite like the Mardi Gras parades. They're not as commercial as a lot of Mardi Gras. So it's like you have to be in some of the, you know, the neighborhoods off the beaten path to see it happen. But it is amazing. It's amazing to see. And then Mardi Gras in general, I remember when I went to Northwestern as a freshman and I was young, I was 17. I remember when I told people I was from New Orleans, immediately, I think everyone I met was like, oh, Mardi Gras. They always associated immediately. And so it kind of annoyed me, I think, as you know, a young woman. But yes, it's definitely a huge part of it. And even though Dan and I aren't like completely fond of huge crowds and especially like drunken, you know, crowds, it's fun to see the revelry. I mean, people have so much fun and really let themselves, you know, just let loose at Mardi Gras. And we definitely have our favorite parades. I mean, there's so many parades and they go on. It's not just Mardi Gras Day, Fat Tuesday, which is the day before Ash Wednesday. Again, very Catholic influence. It goes for weeks before that. And so, you know, you see all these different parades and our favorite ones are the Crew of Chewbacca, which is a sci-fi fantasy one, which is awesome. And then the Crew of Barkus. Both of those are play on the Crew of Bacchus, which is one of our super crews. That's one of the oldest parades. And usually like the grand marshals or celebrities, you know, people you'd recognize, actors and singers. And so Crew of Chewbacca is obviously a play on that. It's a Star Wars reference. And Crew of Barkus is pets. It's all dogs dressed up and stuff. It's great. It used to go right past our apartment on St. Anne. And that was awesome. We would just walk right outside and with a bowl of water for the passing puppies and just watch them. And it was awesome. That was great. There's another one called Crew de View, which happens usually in the early part of the season. It goes through the French Quarter. It's one of the few you know, parades that do go through the French Quarter, and it's usually very irreverent. You know, it's usually making fun of like President Trump or whatever is going on, usually in a political sphere. And it's pretty raunchy, but it's pretty hilarious, and it's very New Orleans. We got married on January 6, 2001 in Las Vegas. We at that time did not live in New Orleans. I, of course, was from there, and for some reason, it completely missed my awareness that January 6th is actually the start of the carnival season. That's King's Day. And I thought, how funny is that it sort of like foreshadowed our, you know, connection to the city and that we would one day call it home. And it's just weird because I was totally clueless at the time, early 20s, didn't even think about it.
That's why I always tell her she's a bad New Orleanian.
I'm a bad New Orleanian.
Bad New Orleanian. So talking of partying, any particular things to eat or drink while in the city?
Okay, I'll let Dan, because he's awesome at cooking.
I was telling Laura, if you remember the Forrest Gump, when Bubba's going through his list of shrimp recipes, I could quite literally do the same thing for everything that I love about New Orleans cuisines. I mean, the drinks are one thing. You can find some interesting cocktails.
Like the Hurricane, which will knock you under the table.
The hand grenade. People do not drink the hand grenade.
Please don't drink that.
It's got like 8 shots of alcohol in it.
It'll do bad things.
Yeah. And it creates the whole drunken tourist
right,
thing.
Exactly.
But I mean, as far as food goes, like Laura said, I love to cook, fell in love with the city. I mean, gumbo, jambalaya.
Shrimp po' boys.
Every possible Cajun or Creole
crawfish etouffee. Yeah, it goes on and on.
And like Laura was saying earlier, the city is really tied to seafood because, you know, we're on the Mississippi and we're close to the Gulf. So we get fresh shrimp, we get crawfish,
right?
Which is a very, very big deal in New Orleans. Crawfish boils are like a social occasion.
Yes, they're awesome.
If you're going to have a party, you have a boil.
Right.
And I would say those are
well. And Dan, every summer up here, when we're in northern Michigan, where we sometimes spend part of our summers, Dan always does a seafood boil for the family, and it's become like a yearly tradition now. They love it because it's our way of bringing a little bit of Louisiana up here, and it is just so much fun. The way that it works is, you boil whatever seafood you're going to boil and a bunch of vegetables, and then you just dump it on a picnic bench, and people just attack it, and it's just awesome. It's just, again, part of the very social, part of the revelry. So New Orleans. But I was going to add that even though we have a lot of favorite restaurants, I mean, like we love getting raw oysters at Oceana in the French Quarter. Mona Lisa restaurant is this really great little Italian restaurant in the more residential part of the French Quarter that has different Mona Lisa paintings all over the wall, like a Snoopy version. And it's really hilarious. It's like they actually want you, if you ever stumble upon a Mona Lisa, some kind of Mona Lisa painting, they want you to bring it in if possible. But that's a great little place. But anyway, we have a lot of wonderful, favorite restaurants, but Dan has completely spoiled me because he is seriously the best cook I know and completely gets the Cajun Creole cuisine. And so actually it's difficult for me to eat out now in New Orleans because nothing ever quite tastes as good as Dan's version.
Right. We're all coming to your place. I think one of the other things, I know it's very touristy, but the beignets, what is a beignet and where do people get them?
Oh my gosh, beignets. I know, it's so funny. They're very simple. Basically, they're just French donuts, like fried donuts with powdered sugar on them. I mean, it's like as basic as you can get, but they're delicious and they're served throughout the city. The most famous place would be Café du Monde, which is the original place is in the French Quarter as part of the French Market. And it's this lovely old building, this beautiful green and white awning that everybody, recognizes in the city. And it's open literally every day of the year except from 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve and into Christmas Day. That's it. Otherwise, it is literally 365 days, 24 hours a day. And all they do is they have an indoor part and an outdoor part. And like at late at night, they'll move everybody like to one or the other and then just spray down the sidewalk and the patio of all the powdered sugar. Because of course that goes everywhere. But it's great. And like as a kid, as a teenager in growing up in New Orleans, that was the place that kids went to after dances. Like we'd go to our high school prom and then go to Café du Monde late at night and stuff ourselves with beignets. So it's definitely a huge part of growing up in New Orleans. And yes, if you visit, you absolutely have to try it. And then I personally like having it with a cup of cafe au lait, which is coffee that has a lot of milk and sugar in it. Yeah. Okay, a lot of milk. I put a lot of sugar in it.
If you visit Café du Monde late at night and there are police officers in there in their full dress uniforms, you'll notice that they're not getting powdered sugar on their beignets. Because I'm quite sure they're not supposed to be in Café du Monde eating donuts.
Yes, and they're wearing black.
It's hilarious.
So they don't want it all over. It would be obvious that they had stopped for beignets because it's impossible. No matter how hard you try, you will get it on you. It's like that's just
powdered sugar everywhere.
Yes, and that's
I must say I did enjoy my beignets at Café du Monde. It was very good. But I want to come back to water. You've mentioned Katrina. You mentioned the Mississippi there and the seafood. And I went kayaking out on the bayou there and went on a alligator tour and that. So explain a bit more about how water plays such a central part in the city.
Well, I mean, I think there are both positive and negative aspects of it. Obviously, it was settled, long ago, 300 plus years ago, because of its location. It is kind of a swampy area, so that you'll see that throughout the city too. A lot of broken sidewalks and stuff. That's just the nature of it. That's why it's also a very hot, sultry place. But anyway, I think that it being a port city is obviously a main reason that water is so important. We're right on the Mississippi River, very close to the Gulf. Seafood is a big part of it. As a kid, fishing was an incredibly important activity for me and my dad. And my dad actually owned a fishing camp at one time that was out in the water. You could only get to it via a boat, and it was incredible. But Hurricane Katrina came along and took out a lot of stuff, including the fishing camp. And if you go out there now, it's just a bunch of pilings and like part of the dock. It's really sad because I have so many memories of that place and it's just gone. And a lot of places are like that, obviously, after Katrina, because the tidal surge was just so powerful that it just, so that's the negative aspect, the fact that we're so close and we don't have as many barrier islands anymore, barrier wetlands.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of that. And a lot of people will say, well, New Orleans you live in a bowl because it's below sea level. A lot of the city is. But the fact is, we used to have barrier islands and hundreds and thousands of miles of wetlands protected the city. And they've gone away, not just because of Katrina and not just because of hurricanes. All along the Mississippi River during the 20th century, they built levees to keep the water from flooding
other towns.
What used to be the floodplains. Mississippi used to flood every single year, and they were great floods. I mean, just enormous. Well, in order to prevent that, they built levees, and it changed how the sediment flowed into the Gulf. The sediment was needed to rebuild our barrier islands. So eventually the barrier islands started to disappear. We still had all of the bayous, all of the land, the wetlands to protect us, but those started vanishing too because we gave the oil companies the rights to build canals through all of the bayous. I mean, there is a MRGO, or what we call the Mr. Go canal the oil companies dug. It started off at 100 yards wide, and it's like 75 miles long. Right now, it's a mile wide.
Yeah.
And all that does is bring the salt water up into what is sometimes no longer even brackish. It just becomes salt water, and it kills the plants and erodes.
And the fish, like a lot of times, there are fish that are more freshwater versus saltwater. So that's not necessarily great, kind of combining that,
right.
The waters like that. And so that's kind of a negative aspect. And so I will say when Hurricane Katrina happened, I was fiercely, defending my city because you saw a lot of stuff on the news about how it was a very poor Black town and why are we rebuilding it? And, it got very racial. First of all, the city the entire city was affected. I mean, my mom lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly white. There were Black families there as well. But I mean, it was a mix, and all those houses were ruined, either outright destroyed or flooded so badly that they had to be, reconstructed and everything. And so it wasn't just the poor Black neighborhoods. It was everyone that got affected. But yes, the African-American neighborhoods that were affected, it was really bad in a lot of cases because they had either insurance, they didn't have insurance, or insurance companies cheated them. So it was hard for people to rebuild, to come back to the city. So it definitely had an effect. And I was so angry listening to the national media and just them talking about why are we rebuilding New Orleans? It's in a bowl. And it's like, yeah, but when it was established upriver and it had all these wetlands to protect it. It's not like they picked a vulnerable place. They established a place that was protected. It's just because of things that the country has done in general in other places, it's affected down there. And so it's hard to hear people say, why are you going to rebuild that place when it's our entire nation that affected it, including the Army Corps of Engineers that constructed levees that were not strong enough to withstand
the hurricane water.
They knew they weren't. And Katrina really proved that. So I think that, yeah, there's definitely a negative aspect, but only in a way because of humanity, because of things people have done. Otherwise, I think it's a wonderful place to establish a city. And it's such an important port town, in the country.
And there's nothing like being out on the bayous if you're fishing just touring or kayaking like you did. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an amazing place. The
ecosystem of it.
Yeah, the ecosystem is amazing. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I remember right, there's a picture somewhere of you holding a little baby alligator. I just want to let you know that alligator is probably now big enough to kill you.
Yes, probably.
Well, it's interesting because I really love the history of the city, but I think I enjoyed kayaking in the bayou the most because, and it was a great tour, and I highly recommend people, get out the city when they visit, because I learned so much about, the Louisiana ecosystem, and also what people are doing to try and bring back a lot of that, those islands, and change the way the water flows.
Right.
It was really, really interesting. So so many people just think it's about the parties, but actually there's this very rich natural habitat as well. Now we could talk forever about this stuff, but we're running out of time. So I do want to ask you, because you guys have obviously lived all over the place, and you talk about New Orleans as being home, but you travel a lot in your RV. So what does travel mean to you, and how does it help your writing?
I think Captain Jack Sparrow said it best. It's freedom. It's the freedom to go and experience different cultures around the country. It's inspirational to us. I mean, when we travel with Serenity, we try to stay in a place and do what the locals do, and see what the locals, what's important to them. And that's, I think, a big part of our writing. I mean, not just all over the country, but in New Orleans as well. In fact, that's always my advice to anybody going to New Orleans. It's do what the locals do. Go where they go. Get off of Bourbon Street, because that's not New Orleans. And you'll find that all around the country. Do what the locals do, and we enjoy experiencing that.
Right. And that's definitely what we do when we encourage people, to explore the city. I mean, we tell them the same, as you just said, that to get out of the city and go do swamp tours and plantation tours and really get to know the history of the region. But also in the city itself, we encourage people to go on Frenchman Street in the Marigny. The Spotted Cat Music Club is our favorite place. It's got live jazz and blues. It's awesome. So we want people to experience, more of the culture than just Bourbon Street has to offer. So, yeah, I think that Dan's right. I think when we travel, we try to do the same. We try to do what the locals do and really get to know a place. We don't tend to move around like a lot. We'll move to a place and kind of stay there for a couple of weeks, and try to get to know it and then move on. And I think that helps us to appreciate places a little better, and not just like tourists. We try to get to know, what people do and respect it from the point of view of the residents, people who live there.
Sorry, Dan.
No, she just said everything I wanted to say.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I totally jumped. I'm so sorry.
Oh, stop.
Okay, so apart from zombie chaos and your guidebook to the city, let me start again. Sorry, this has fallen off the rails now. Okay, serious. So fantastic. Now, apart from zombie chaos and your guidebook, what are some other books that you recommend reading that are either about New Orleans or set in the city?
Well, my favorite author, which is kind of funny because I write zombies, I write sci-fi, and write fantasy, but my favorite author is James Lee Burke. And James Lee Burke grew up in southern Louisiana, New Orleans, New Iberia, which is in Cajun country. And he wrote a book called The Tin Roof Blowdown, which is his story taking place just after Katrina hits. And it follows a character that he's written over 20 books about, the Dave Robichaux, who's a detective who starts off as a New Orleans detective and eventually moves to New Iberia and gets involved in a lot of different mysteries. But his writing is so beautiful, how he describes southern Louisiana, how he describes New Orleans. In fact, one of his main characters lived on the same street, just a couple of doors down from where Laura and I lived.
On Ursuline, or St. Anne. Yeah, that's right.
No, it was Ursuline.
Oh, it was Ursuline. Yeah. That's right. See, we've lived all over. We get very confused. But yeah, I love James Lee Burke too. And definitely as a native, I think he just, I feel that he captures the city and the region very well. And Tin Roof Blowdown is highly recommended if you want to kind of get a native's point of view of sort of what happened after Katrina and everything, immediately after. It's very interesting, but it's a novel, it's fiction. And other novels that I love, Interview with a Vampire, of course, I kind of feel like you have to read. And A Confederacy of Dunces is a great book. It's very classic. John Kennedy Toole wrote it, and he died, actually killed himself, and his mother found it and actually had it published with the help of Walker Percy, the author of The Moviegoer. And it's it won the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, it's so sad because it's all posthumous, but that's a wonderful book. It really captures the dialect and a lot of the landmarks of the city. But I have to mention this. Dan's favorite children's book of all time is The Cajun Night Before Christmas. It is awesome. It's so funny. And I highly recommend it to anyone, children and adults alike. So, yeah. But there's so many. We could go on and on. I mean, I think even reading the cookbooks of New Orleans, teaches you a lot about the history in the city. So there's so many. We'd be here forever.
No, that's fantastic. I love that Cajun children's book. That just sounds a little different, which is fantastic. So where can people find you and your books online?
Well, we have a website called themartones.com because, yes, we pretty much do everything together. And then also our books are mostly on Amazon right now. And I know how you feel about Amazon, but that's just where they are at the moment. And I think that I would say we have space opera and, other things out there. But I would say if you want to get a taste of New Orleans, read the first book in the Zombie Chaos series. And you definitely, because it's our kind of messed up love letter to the city with zombies.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
this
Joe.
was so much fun.
Thanks for joining me today on the Books and Travel podcast. I hope you found a moment of escape. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page. And if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my books for free at jfpen.com/free. Happy travels until next time.